A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to have you with us here. We're going to be talking today about a potential, I think a likely infringement on the right to keep and bear arms taking place in our nation's capital. Steve Gutowski, the Washington Free Beacon, going to join us in just a few minutes to talk about that. But before we get to that, some news from the Supreme Court where in a 5-4 decision, once again, Chief Justice John Roberts, a part of the liberal majority, striking down the president's decision to rescind DACA, the program that was established via executive order by President Barack Obama. Court saying that, the president can undo DACA with an executive order of his own, just not the one that he actually used. President Trump took to Twitter today to go after the Supreme Court decision and remind folks that the Second Amendment is next when it comes to Supreme Court action. Speaking of the president, word from our sponsor, President Trump and the Trump campaign has a special offer just for you. President Trump wants to meet you. This will be the first opportunity that he has had to meet with American patriots like you since the country started reopening. His team's going to cover the flight, hotel, and give you VIP access for yourself and a guest to even take a picture with you. All you have to do is text ENGAGE to 88022 for your chance to meet President Trump. Again, that's ENGAGE to 88022 to enter to win this contest and to join President Trump in the fight to keep America great for 4 more years. It's paid for by Donald J. Trump for President Incorporated. So getting back to what's going on in Washington, D.C., where ever since the Heller decision struck down the ban on handguns in Washington, D.C., those who wish to purchase a handgun in D.C. have actually had to leave the district in order to do so because there are no gun stores in the district. So if you want a handgun, you've got to go to Maryland or Virginia, closest states anyway, pick out what you want, and then you have to have that firearm transferred into the district. There's been one guy that's been responsible for all of the transfers over the past decade or so, a guy named Charles Sykes, until recently, when Mr. Sykes decided he no longer wanted to do these transfers. So what's happened next? Nothing good. As our friend Stephen Gutowski, the Washington Free Beacon, explains, we spoke with Stephen about the latest bad developments in our nation's capital when it comes to the exercise of our right to keep and bear arms. Take a look and a listen. Stephen, it is good to see you again, sir. Thanks for coming on the program today.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You got a great piece at the Free Beacon published just a couple of days ago about, as you say, it's a unique situation in Washington, D.C., large part because of the city's really just bizarre gun control laws. It's been more than a decade since the Heller decision struck down D.C.'s gun ban, but we still don't have a gun store in Washington, D.C. So anybody who wants to purchase a firearm, they've got to purchase their gun in Virginia or Maryland, have that firearm then transferred into the district, and the one sole person in Washington, D.C. who conducted firearm transfers, well, he's not doing it anymore.
Yeah, essentially, there's just no legal way to buy a handgun now because you can buy, long guns across state lines without having a transfer under federal law. But for handguns, federal law, which has been challenged, and actually the case was just denied by the Supreme Court on Monday. But, federal law says you have to transfer a handgun that you purchased out of state through an FFL in your state. And this creates obviously a problem for DC because in mid-March or so, Charles Sykes, the only FFL left serving, public handgun transfer requests, he just up and quit. And so their solution was, we'll make the police department an FFL, a licensed firearms dealer, which is, according to the ATF, from what they told me, the only place where that's the case. There's no other police department in the United States that's processing handgun transfers like they are in DC. But they said, the ATF's logic was, well, this might be questionable, but it was the only way to ensure that people could legally purchase handguns if they lived inside of Washington, D.C.
But you talked with some folks who say that it's taken weeks, and so far their transfers haven't gone through. They're wondering if the city is even doing the transfers.
Yeah, it's become a problem. Whether it's obviously a problem in theory, with this setup the way it is. Experts told me there's a lot of legal questions going on with whether or not the police department can operate as a federally licensed firearms dealer, especially if they're not trying to run a firearms business. But there's also a practical question here, which is, will DC actually follow through on processing these transfers in a timely manner? And so far, they haven't. I've had two people now tell me that essentially the police department has just ignored their transfer requests. They've ignored their emails and the emails of the FFLs who sold the firearm in the first place. So it's not a good situation right now in DC. It's becoming impossible to legally buy a handgun.
And again, I mean, the city has put up so many barriers to people who might want to open up a gun store in Washington, D.C., that nobody's, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has even attempted to do so in the decade or so since the Heller decision was handed down.
There's been one attempt to put in a range and gun store in the city, but that's been held up for years. Similar to, I think, what's going on in Chicago, where there was issues with the zoning regulations, making it nearly impossible to open a gun store or a gun range within the city limits. And I think that you're seeing the exact same thing in Washington, D.C., because it's hard for me, as somebody who lives near the city, there's a town called Woodbridge, Virginia, probably about 45 minutes outside of the city, where at one point they had 3 different gun stores open to the public there. And you're telling me that a small town in Virginia can support that many gun stores, but the entire city of Washington, D.C. can't support a single one? I mean, it just sort of doesn't pass the laugh test. And so it seems fairly obvious. And experts, pointed this out to me in my piece, that it's probably due to the DC government's restrictive zoning practices, and the fact that the city government is very hostile towards gun ownership within the city and have publicly been so for decades. And so, I think that's where this problem that they've come up with this very novel solution to arises from, is the fact that they just don't want people to own guns, and they don't want someone to open a gun store.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it would be nice to think that, okay, well, maybe we can challenge this in court and get some relief here. But given what we've seen this week from the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm not confident that any sort of legal challenge to what's going on in D.C. would ever be heard by the Supreme Court, much less be decided in gun owners' favor.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this week was discouraging for gun rights advocates at the court. I think everyone was pretty surprised by just a wholesale removal of all of the gun cases that were before them to be, decided on. And, there's plenty of speculation as to why that happened or what that means going forward. Certainly the court hasn't taken a substantial gun case since McDonald in 2011. They did take Citrino, Massachusetts in 2016,
the
which was about stun guns. And so that was significant, but it didn't really expand much on the Heller McDonald decisions, and so that's been the hope for at least a decade now, that the court would do that, and they just keep not doing that. I mean, obviously they took the New York case this year, but then New York came up with a way to get them to dismiss it as moot. So I don't know.
Maybe the answer, Stephen, is we need to set up the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone East in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Washington, D.C., like they've done in Seattle.
There you go.
Because, in Seattle, they're ignoring the state's gun laws. I've seen videos of people transferring AR-15s without going through a background check and things of that nature. So maybe if we have Chaz East, then we can just set up our own gun store there in the autonomous zone, and you and I can become the first gun store in Washington, D.C. in decades.
Well, there you go. That's one way of looking at it. I don't know that I want to live in a tent on the street, though.
We don't have to live there. We can just work there.
I suppose that's true. I guess I don't know if those activists all live in that little stretch of town that they've taken over. But yeah, I mean, your point's valid there. I mean, in terms of what's going on in Seattle with sort of this wholesale forfeiture of a part of the city, and complete and total surrender on enforcement of laws within that zone, including gun laws, surprisingly, and including even getting extremely positive press coverage for their flouting of gun laws and sort of creating their own vigilante force. It's truly a bizarre thing to witness.
It is. I mean, particularly as you say, the media reaction and the reaction from some of these politicians. You know, Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State, was very quick to dismiss and criticize the Second Amendment sanctuary movement when it was popping up in the state late last year and early this year. Nothing about the autonomous zone, no criticism there. And then the Washington Post, I think we were talking about this before we started the interview, just this glowing profile of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone or Occupied Zone or whatever the heck they're calling it in Seattle, including, Stephen, a couple of paragraphs where they talk about, the volunteer security forces there and how some of them are armed. And there's a sentinel that goes by the name of James Madison who's got his AR-15 slung across his chest. And this is the first time I think I've ever seen any writer in the Washington Post mention an AR-15 without criticizing the person who owned it. But apparently, I guess to the Post, it's maybe not so much the gun that's bad as it is most gun owners now who own them. If you own them for the wrong reasons, according to the Washington Post, you get criticized. But if they agree with your politics, I guess maybe you get a pass.
I mean, it certainly seems that way. You can't imagine if the politics were reversed for the people involved up there, that they would get glowing coverage like that. It's pretty bizarre. I mean, it's also it's so weird too, because the idea of these people are pushing for at Chaz or CHOP or whatever they call it now, is a complete abolition of police. Some of the more extreme elements that have been taken over this part of the city. But essentially, they've just set up their own unregulated police force. I mean, they claim that they're using different tactics than normal police, de-escalation and all that, and so forth. But I mean, really, that's what they've set up, is like this vigilante police force inside of this autonomous zone. And it's just a weird thing to read about the way the Post goes about describing this in such like childish terms. Like there's centuries. They don't, they perform a policing duty. I mean, it's based off of no written laws and without any oversight whatsoever. I mean, you could criticize the state of our current oversight of police or police union contracts and all that. There's plenty of room to talk about reform and debate the issues of the day, but at least we have something going on with oversight for police, and we have actual written rules that they're supposed to follow. I mean, obviously it becomes a problem if they don't follow those rules, but if you don't even have rules and you don't have any sort of oversight, and there's no, these people are just self-appointed essentially as well, in who's a sentry in the autonomous zone, that's where things fall apart. And you've seen a number of incidents inside of that area. It's where they've just basically, reverted to the state of nature. Right. I don't want to be too dramatic about what's going on there, but certainly there have been incidents where there was an arson attempt, and there's been incidents where a street preacher or this guy who was antagonizing people got tackled and put in a chokehold and physically assaulted, and people have had stuff stolen. And it's just like, it certainly doesn't look like the utopia that I guess they're striving for. And a lot of the things they're doing just look like rudimentary versions of what we do as a society, and what they're saying is wrong in the first place.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. Hey, Stephen, listen, man, I appreciate you coming on the program. It is always good to catch up with you. One of these days before long, you and I are going to get a chance to go shooting again together. Yeah. But, in the meantime, I at least appreciate the long distance conversation. Hope we get a chance to do this again soon, too.
Absolutely.
Before we get to today's armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, and our recidivist report, just another reminder here that the Trump campaign has a special offer just for you. President Trump wants to meet you. It'll be the first opportunity that he has had to meet patriots like yourself since the country started reopening. So his team will cover the flight, cover hotel, and even give you VIP access for you and a friend. He will even take a picture with you if you would like. All you have to do is text ENGAGE to 88022. for your chance to meet President Trump. Again, that's ENGAGE to 88022 to enter to win this contest and to join President Trump in the fight to keep America great for 4 more years. Paid for by Donald J. Trump for President, Incorporated. All right, let's get to today's armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, our recidivist report. It's where we will begin today out of Louisville, Kentucky, where a Louisville man is in custody after allegedly shooting a taxi driver in the neck following a dispute over a cab fare. The 22-year-old suspect facing a number of charges, Roderick Miller, charged with attempted murder, first-degree assault, as well as possessing a handgun as a convicted felon, along with a probation violation stemming from a 2018 robbery conviction. He's just 22 years of age. He's already a convicted felon, already convicted of robbery, and already unfortunately back out on the streets. Louisville Metro police officers arrested him at his home Wednesday night in connection with the shooting back on June 11th, which was shortly before 5 o'clock in the morning on June 11th. Police responded to a neighborhood there in Louisville, found a taxi in the street with a man in the driver's seat had been shot in the neck. He remains in, quote, grave condition after suffering paralysis. Detectives collected surveillance videos, audio recordings, phone records during their investigation. They identified Miller as the suspected shooter. They determined that Miller and the victim had started arguing over the payment for that cab ride, that Miller then pulled out a gun, shot the victim in the neck. A firearm of the same caliber and shell casings found at the scene of the shooting, found in the room where Miller was hiding on a Wednesday night. He is again in the local jail ahead of an arraignment set for today. But a lot of questions remain about why this 22-year-old convicted felon was out in the streets instead of behind bars to begin with. Now, our armed citizen story of the day, a headline from the Herald Courier newspaper in Bristol, Tennessee, Dateline Nicholsville, Virginia, where authorities say a man who tried to force his way into a home in Nicholsville was greeted by an armed homeowner inside. This was Tuesday night. Sheriff's office responded to a home on Twin Springs Road in Nicholsville. Call was in reference to a man attempting to force his way inside a residence where 2 women and 2 small children were inside. Sheriff's office says that the man, identified as 32-year-old Jared Scott Dockery, gained entry to the home before deputies were able to get there. He was shot and killed upon entry. His body has been sent to the office of the chief medical examiner in Roanoke, Virginia. Case is currently under investigation, but right now it looks like this was a case of self-defense from one of the occupants in that home, as Mr. Dockery, again, forced his way inside the residence. We will keep our eyes out for any more details on that story. And we do have a couple of other armed citizen stories that we've been reporting on at Bearing Arms over the past couple of days. One, a pharmacist in St. George, Utah, able to defuse a burglary without firing any shots. And we've got an update on a armed citizen story out of Michigan, where a concealed carry holder shot and killed a man who was standing in the middle of a busy highway outside of Saginaw, Michigan, earlier this week, pointing a gun at people in their cars, firing up into the air. And we've got some more details that have been released in that shooting, so make sure you follow along at bearingarms.com. Finally today, our good deed of the day out of Pennsylvania, where a Port Authority police officer saved 2 people after a fiery car crash. This was on Wednesday. Port Authority of Allegheny County Police say a officer, Sergeant Fukas, saw a car on fire and rescued 2 of 3 people involved in this crash, including, by the way, a child who was trapped inside of this burning vehicle. As the Port Authority of Allegheny says, his actions indicative of the level of character and training portrayed by all Port Authority officers. So in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. We thank Sergeant Fukas for his very good deed. That is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. I want to thank you for being a part of the program as always. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Town Hall Media. That way you never miss a program. Or Bearing Arms Cam & Company on Apple Podcasts or any of the other fine podcast platforms. We will be back tomorrow with more of the latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation. Until then, be well, be safe, be free, and we'll see you soon with another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam & Company.